Look, I didn't do anything wrong, just drank too much and crashed on a couch I used to know. But my husband said I betrayed him, packed his bags that night, and served me papers before I even understood what was happening. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. I always told myself I wasn't the kind of woman who betrayed her family, that I only needed a little space, a little fun to feel like myself, and if Daniel couldn't understand that, then it was his fault for being so rigid. My name is Isolde Maris. I'm 33 years old, and I work as an HR coordinator at a small logistics firm where people see me as approachable, patient, and fair. At the office, everyone relies on me to settle disputes, but at home, Daniel often acted like I was the source of every conflict. He wanted routine, order, and quiet, while I wanted to breathe, to remind myself I wasn't just a wife and mother. That's why, when my cousin Felix suggested I go out for a few drinks with friends, I didn't hesitate. I thought I deserved it after another long week, and when Adrian, my old boyfriend from years back, happened to join us, I convinced myself it was nothing. We laughed like old times, talked about our jobs and families, and after a few drinks I felt warm, dizzy, and careless. I told myself there was no harm in letting him call a cab for me, but when I admitted I felt too unsteady to go home, he offered his couch. I repeated in my head that it was innocent, that I was too tired to argue, and that Daniel would understand if I just explained. When I woke on Adrian's couch the next morning, sunlight glaring through the blinds, my head pounding, I froze. It felt wrong, even though nothing had happened. Adrian had already left for an early shift, leaving me a note and water, but the couch itself felt like evidence of something I hadn't done but couldn't easily defend. I told myself no one would know, that I would head home, shower, and move on, but my phone buzzed with a message before I could even gather my things. Felix had sent a picture. It was me, curled up on Adrian's couch, blanket pulled over me, eyes closed. He said someone had posted it on social media and joked that I had quite the reunion. My stomach flipped as I realized how fast one careless moment had traveled. When I returned home later that morning, Daniel was waiting. He asked where I'd been, his voice flat but sharp. I smiled and said work had drained me, that I had stayed late with friends and maybe had one drink too many. He asked if I had been alone, and I shook my head, saying it was nothing, that he was being paranoid again. I told him I was tired of his endless suspicion, tired of his constant need to turn everything into a crisis. He stared at me with that look I had grown used to, the one where he didn't trust me but didn't want to explode in front of Lena. She was at the kitchen table coloring, and I told myself she wasn't listening, that children didn't absorb everything, even though her little shoulders tensed when Daniel and I exchanged words. I spent the afternoon convincing myself that the photo would fade into the background, that people would laugh and move on, but by evening Daniel's phone buzzed with the image. Someone had sent it to him directly. He held it up, his face pale, and asked if I had fallen asleep on Adrian's couch. I laughed lightly, saying it was ridiculous, that I was tipsy and crashed for safety, that it was better than driving home. I asked him if he would rather I risk my life on the road just to keep his pride intact. He said it looked like betrayal. I said he always thought the worst of me, always twisted things to make me the villain, and that he was embarrassing himself by clinging to suspicion. That night, after Lena went to bed, he asked again, quieter this time, why I hadn't called, why I hadn't told him where I was. I rolled my eyes and said I didn't need to report every move like a child asking permission. I told him he was suffocating me, making me feel trapped, and that maybe if he trusted me more, I wouldn't have to defend myself against nonsense like this. He didn't argue back. He just went silent, sitting at the edge of the bed with his back to me. His silence unsettled me, but I told myself it was better than shouting. The next day, I called Felix and told him Daniel was being impossible. Felix laughed, said Daniel had always been too uptight, that men like him couldn't stand women having any freedom. His casual dismissal gave me relief, like I was right all along, like the problem wasn't me, but Daniel's stubborn pride. Felix told me to forget it, that the couch meant nothing, that people would move on. I clung to those words, repeated them like a shield, even though deep down I felt the weight of the photo pressing on me. Still, when Daniel's mother, Marjorie, found out, she called me directly. Her voice was cold as she said I had humiliated her son and confused her granddaughter. I tried to argue, saying Daniel was exaggerating, but she cut me off, saying mothers know the truth even when their children won't say it. Her judgment burned, and I slammed the phone down, convincing myself she was just bitter and controlling, too old-fashioned to understand modern marriage. By the end of that week, the photo had made its way into the whispers of neighbors and co-workers. At the office, someone asked jokingly if I had fun on the couch, and I forced a smile, acting unbothered. Inside, my stomach twisted, but I told myself appearances mattered, that if I held my head high, no one could touch me. At home, Daniel moved more quietly, speaking less, avoiding my eyes. Lena grew quieter too, sitting in her room with her dolls, watching us from doorways. I told myself she was too young to really understand, but her silence followed me like a shadow. Then, one evening, Daniel sat me down at the kitchen table. His bag was by the door. He said he couldn't do this anymore, that he was tired of being humiliated, tired of raising Lena in a house full of lies. I told him he was overreacting, destroying our family over nothing. He said nothing was exactly the problem, that nothing was all I ever admitted to. Then he stood, lifted his bag, and walked upstairs to gather Lena. My chest tightened as I realized he wasn't bluffing. He was leaving, and for the first time, I couldn't spin the story fast enough to stop him. The family dinner was supposed to be ordinary, just another Sunday gathering at my parents' house, but from the moment Daniel and I walked in, I felt the tension pressing down like heavy air before a storm. He carried himself stiffly, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the ground, while I smiled brightly, determined to prove to everyone that nothing was wrong. I greeted my parents, hugged my cousin Felix, and even joked about the traffic, pretending life was normal. But I could feel Daniel's silence pulling attention, and soon enough people were looking at us, waiting for him to speak. I hated that he had the power to control the mood just by sitting there like a wounded victim. As we sat around the long table, passing dishes of roast chicken and vegetables, I tried to steer the conversation toward safe topics, asking about my father's new hobby and my mother's plans for the garden. But Daniel remained quiet, and I knew what was coming before he even reached into his pocket. He pulled out his phone and laid it flat on the table. The screen lit up with the photo, me asleep on Adrian's couch, blanket pulled over me, mouth slightly open in exhaustion. The image seemed louder than any shout. My mother gasped softly, while Felix leaned back with a grin, clearly enjoying the drama. Daniel asked in a calm but tight voice if I wanted to explain to everyone why his wife had spent the night at another man's apartment. I felt my cheeks burn, not with shame, but with fury that he would dare humiliate me in front of my own family. I laughed lightly, shaking my head as if he were ridiculous. I told everyone he was blowing things out of proportion, that I'd been tipsy and too responsible to drive, so I crashed on a couch for safety. I emphasized the word responsible, hoping to make him sound unreasonable for seeing betrayal where there was none. Felix jumped in immediately, telling Daniel to relax, that people could be friends with exes and it didn't mean anything. He said Daniel needed to loosen up, that women deserved space. I smiled at Felix, grateful for his support, and repeated that Daniel's paranoia was embarrassing us all. But then Daniel's mother, Marjorie, who had been quiet until then, slammed her fork against her plate and glared at me. She said no decent wife slept under another man's roof, drunk or not, and that I had shamed her son and confused her granddaughter. Her words cut deep, and for a moment I felt exposed, but I quickly retreated into anger. I told her she was old-fashioned, that she had always looked down on me, and that she didn't get to dictate how I lived my life. The table fell silent, the roast chicken untouched, the clink of cutlery gone. My father cleared his throat awkwardly, muttering something about not ruining dinner, but no one listened. Daniel didn't argue further. He didn't raise his voice or try to defend himself. Instead, he stood up, pushed his chair back, and walked away from the table. Lena, who had been sitting quietly beside him, looked at him with wide eyes before scurrying after him. I called out, asking where he thought he was going, but he didn't answer. He came back a few minutes later with Lena's small backpack slung over his shoulder and his own duffel bag in his hand. My heart stopped as I realized he had packed before dinner, prepared for this moment. He didn't look at me as he told my parents he was leaving early. My mother stammered, asking if everything was all right, but he ignored her and walked out the door with Lena at his side. The silence that followed was suffocating. Felix tried to laugh it off, saying Daniel was dramatic, that he would be back in a day once he cooled down. I nodded quickly, agreeing, insisting Daniel always liked to play the martyr. But Marjorie's words lingered, sharp and accusing, as she told me I had finally pushed her son too far. I snapped back that Daniel had always been weak, always jealous, and that he was the one tearing the family apart, not me. My father finally spoke, his voice low, asking me to stop. He said he didn't want more shouting in his house. I fell quiet then, but inside my anger burned hotter than ever. That night, when I returned to the family home, the emptiness struck me like a blow. Daniel's shoes were gone from the entryway, his jacket missing from the hook, Lena's favorite stuffed animal absent from her bed. The house felt hollow, as though life had been sucked out with them. I called Daniel immediately, demanding to know where he was. He didn't answer. I left message after message, my voice shifting from anger to pleading to threats, but he remained silent. Felix texted me later, saying not to panic, that Daniel was just making a statement, that he would crawl back once he realized he couldn't handle being alone. I clung to those words like a lifeline, but when I lay in bed staring at the empty side where Daniel used to sleep, dread coiled in my stomach. The next morning, I showed up at work and tried to act normal, but whispers had already spread. Someone had seen the photo online, and now colleagues exchanged knowing looks when I walked past. At lunch, one asked jokingly if the couch was comfortable, and I forced a laugh, pretending I wasn't shaken. But the laughter felt like knives, and I realized Daniel's silence was louder than any public defense I could mount. By staying quiet, by leaving me alone to explain, he had let the world write the story without me. At home that evening, I walked through the rooms, opening closets and drawers, seeing the gaps where his clothes and Lena's toys used to be. It was then that fear settled deeper than before. He wasn't bluffing, not this time. I told myself I still had the upper hand, that he had acted rashly, that he would soon see reason, but the image of him walking out with his bags replayed endlessly in my mind. I poured myself a glass of wine, sat at the kitchen table, and whispered aloud that I had done nothing wrong. But the words rang hollow in the empty house, and even I didn't fully believe them anymore. When I pulled into the driveway a few nights later, I noticed the lights glowing warmly from inside, but when I reached for my keys, the lock didn't turn. At first I thought I was fumbling. Maybe the key was stuck, but after several tries, the truth hit me hard. Daniel had changed the locks. My pulse raced as I pounded on the door, calling his name, demanding he let me in. The curtain in the living room shifted slightly, and I caught a glimpse of movement, but the door stayed closed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, it cracked open just enough for Daniel to slide an envelope into my hands. His face was pale, tired, and distant. He said flatly that I should find somewhere else to stay until things were resolved. Then the door clicked shut again, leaving me staring at the cold metal handle as though it had betrayed me too. I ripped open the envelope hands shaking, and saw separation papers. My chest tightened, rage boiling up inside me. How dare he take such a step over something so minor? I immediately called Felix, my voice trembling as I told him Daniel had locked me out. He laughed at first, telling me Daniel was just posturing, that men liked to puff their chests and make threats they didn't mean. But his laughter did little to calm me. Standing outside my own home, clutching legal documents with neighbors peeking through curtains, humiliation burned hotter than anger. Felix said I should call Daniel's bluff, wait him out, and show him I wasn't afraid. I nodded, pretending his words gave me power, but inside I felt small, like the ground had shifted beneath me. The next day I tried again. I stood at the front door mid-afternoon, knowing Lena would be home from school. I knocked softly this time, rehearsing my lines in my head. That I missed her, that I loved her, that Daddy was just confused. The door opened a crack, and Daniel appeared, calm and steady. He handed me another envelope, this one listing temporary visitation schedules and financial notices. His voice was measured, almost gentle, as he said everything I needed was inside. I tried to push the door, but he blocked it effortlessly. My voice rose as I shouted that he was cruel, destroying Lena's childhood, poisoning her against me. His face didn't change. He simply said he was protecting her. Behind him, I saw Lena peeking from the hallway, her small eyes wide and unsure. I reached out my hand, but Daniel closed the door firmly, leaving me to scream into the empty air. Humiliated and furious, I drove to my parents' house, demanding they take my side. My mother looked uneasy, telling me Daniel seemed serious and that perhaps I should talk to a lawyer. My father, always the quiet one, muttered that marriage vows meant something, but he didn't defend me either. Only Felix seemed ready to reassure me, saying Daniel was acting like a dictator, using paperwork to control me. I clung to his words, though I noticed even he was less confident than before. His smirk didn't quite reach his eyes. Later that week, I caught sight of Lena in the school parking lot. She was holding Daniel's hand, her backpack bouncing against her small frame. I rushed forward, my heart aching, and called her name. She stopped, looking at me with hesitant eyes. I knelt down, told her I missed her, that Daddy was only angry, that soon things would go back to normal. She nodded, but she didn't smile. She pulled closer to Daniel, hiding slightly behind his arm. My throat tightened as Daniel looked at me calmly, not saying a word, just guiding her to the car. Other parents watched, their eyes whispering judgment I couldn't escape. I wanted to shout, to make them see me as the victim, but the lump in my throat kept me silent. That night, back at the small apartment I had rented in desperation, I stared at the papers Daniel had given me. Custody schedules, financial freezes, terms I barely understood. I tried to tell myself it was temporary, a tactic to scare me, but the official stamps and signatures told another story. I poured wine into a glass, staring at the ceiling, repeating the same mantra. I hadn't cheated. I hadn't betrayed him. I was innocent. Yet the more I said it, the more hollow it sounded, as though even my own mind was rejecting the script. I tried reaching out to coworkers, hoping for sympathy. I told them Daniel was controlling, that he had locked me out for no reason. But instead of support, I caught the way their eyes flickered to each other, the doubt written across their faces. One asked quietly if it was true I had spent the night at Adrian's apartment. My voice caught as I denied it was anything, saying again it was just a couch, just exhaustion. But I could see they didn't believe me. Their polite nods were worse than insults. They had already decided. By the weekend, I drove back to the family home one more time, desperate to prove I still belonged there. I banged on the door, shouting that he couldn't do this, that he was tearing Lena apart. This time, he opened the door with his lawyer beside him. The lawyer handed me yet another folder, this one outlining the next steps in custody proceedings and financial divisions. I screamed that they were conspiring against me, that they were trying to ruin me. But Daniel just stood there, silent, holding the door steady as though my rage bounced off a wall he had built around himself. Lena peeked again from the staircase behind him, her small face pale. I reached out, but she turned away quickly, disappearing up the steps. The sight cut deeper than any document. As the door shut once more, I stood in the driveway with the folder in my hands, shaking. Neighbors peeked from their windows, and I felt their eyes on me like daggers. I wanted to believe Daniel was bluffing, that this was just some elaborate performance. But the steady rhythm of his actions, the locks, the letters, the lawyer, told me he was building something solid and unstoppable. I drove back to my apartment, the papers heavy on the seat beside me, my reflection in the rearview mirror pale and drawn. I whispered again that I hadn't done anything wrong, but even I could hear the disbelief in my voice. For the first time, I wondered if maybe my words weren't enough anymore. I tried to salvage what I could of my reputation, because if people saw me as calm, rational and composed, then maybe they would believe my version of events instead of Daniel's silent narrative. At work, I forced myself to smile wider than usual, greeting colleagues with too much cheer, insisting whenever anyone asked that Daniel and I were just having a temporary misunderstanding, but whispers followed me down the hallway like shadows. I overheard one coworker tell another that a woman doesn't crash on her ex's couch by accident, and though I pretended not to hear, my stomach twisted. When someone joked at the coffee machine, asking if the couch was more comfortable than my marriage, I forced out laughter and said people were blowing things out of proportion. Inside, I burned with humiliation. Daniel's quiet dignity was making me look like the liar, and I hated that I couldn't twist the story fast enough to keep people on my side. At the next family dinner, the tension was unbearable. Daniel didn't attend this time, but his absence spoke louder than any argument. My mother tried to make conversation about Lena's school projects, but the subject quickly shifted back to me. Felix leaned back in his chair, smirking as he said Daniel was too sensitive, that men always panicked when women had a little freedom. I nodded, eager for his defense, but Marjorie's sharp voice cut through the air. She told Felix he was enabling me, that I had humiliated her son and shattered the family's peace. My father muttered something about not fighting at the table, but the silence that followed his words made it clear no one believed this was just another argument. Lena sat quietly, pushing food around her plate, her shoulders hunched. Her silence weighed heavier than Marjorie's condemnation. I tried to speak to Lena privately after dinner, crouching down to her level, telling her Daddy was just upset, that everything would return to normal soon. She nodded politely, but didn't meet my eyes. I reached for her hand, but she pulled it back, mumbling that she was tired. That rejection pierced me more deeply than any adult's judgment. Still, instead of admitting what I had caused, I told myself Daniel was brainwashing her, turning her against me with his icy silence. In the days that followed, I crafted a story for friends and colleagues, presenting myself as the victim of an overbearing husband. I told them Daniel had locked me out without warning, that he was cruel and controlling, that he couldn't handle the thought of me having a harmless friendship. Some expressed sympathy, but I could see doubt creeping into their eyes. One friend asked softly why I hadn't called Daniel that night, why I had chosen to sleep on Adrian's couch instead of taking a cab home. I snapped back that it was cheaper, safer, and easier, but her quiet expression told me she didn't believe me. The more I defended myself, the less convincing I sounded, even to my own ears. At the office, things grew worse. My boss pulled me aside one morning and asked if everything was all right at home. He said he had overheard staff gossiping about custody papers and lawyers. I forced a laugh, saying people loved drama, but I left the conversation feeling exposed and cornered. The story had escaped beyond my control, and I could no longer reel it back in. Every glance, every half-smile from coworkers carried a weight of judgment. Daniel's silence had given the world permission to fill in the blanks, and every blank was painted against me. Determined to reclaim control, I showed up at Lena's school one afternoon, planning to surprise her and take her for ice cream. I imagined her delighted face, her small hand in mine, proof that I still mattered. But as soon as she stepped outside, I saw Daniel waiting by the gate. He held her hand firmly, his posture steady, his gaze cold. When Lena saw me, she froze, her eyes flicking nervously between us. I smiled, crouched down, and told her I had a treat planned, but Daniel's voice cut softly through the air. He reminded me it wasn't my visitation day. I argued, telling him he was cruel, that he was stealing time from me, but Lena's eyes filled with tears. She pressed closer to him, choosing his steadiness over my chaos. Other parents looked on, whispers rising, and I felt humiliation burn across my face. Daniel didn't argue further. He simply guided her away, leaving me standing alone at the gate, my promises unfulfilled. That night, I called Felix in a rage, telling him Daniel was using lawyers and schedules to erase me from Lena's life. Felix said Daniel was posturing, that courts rarely favored fathers, and that I shouldn't worry. His words should have comforted me, but I noticed how tired his voice sounded, how little conviction he carried now. Even my staunchest ally seemed less certain, and the thought chilled me. A few days later, another letter arrived, this one from Daniel's lawyer. It was a petition for temporary custody, stamped with the court seal. The words blurred as I read them, but I understood enough. He wasn't bluffing. He was taking real steps to secure Lena's life without me in it. My hands shook as I read, and for the first time I felt genuine fear. I wanted to scream, to call Daniel and beg, but I also wanted to curse him for turning Lena into a pawn. I ended up doing nothing but pacing the apartment, whispering to myself that I hadn't cheated, that I hadn't done anything wrong, though the words rang emptier with each repetition. The next family dinner was worse than the last. Marjorie didn't look at me once, and when I tried to speak, she interrupted sharply, saying I should stop pretending innocence. My father sighed and asked everyone to stop shouting, but no one listened. Felix tried again to defend me, but his words sounded weak, as if even he doubted himself now. My mother's face carried disappointment I couldn't erase, and Lena, sweet Lena, barely spoke, her fork moving food across her plate without ever lifting it to her mouth. I wanted to reach for her, to show her love, but her eyes stayed fixed on her lap. When I returned to my apartment that night, I opened the custody petition again, staring at the words that confirmed my fears. Daniel had been building his case quietly, steadily, while I wasted energy spinning stories and blaming him. The realization hit me like ice water. He wasn't fighting me with anger. He was dismantling me with patience and law. The legal office felt colder than any place I had ever walked into, not because of the air, but because of the certainty hanging over the polished wood tables and neat stacks of paper. I sat across from Daniel, who looked calm, composed, and almost distant, as though the emotional storm that had consumed me no longer touched him. His lawyer sat beside him, flipping through folders, while my own lawyer adjusted his glasses nervously, already at a disadvantage. I laughed when the meeting began, a brittle sound, telling them all this was ridiculous, that dragging lawyers into a misunderstanding about a couch was absurd. Daniel didn't flinch. His lawyer slid a packet across the table, each page neatly tabbed, each line perfectly clear. He explained that Daniel had already filed for temporary custody, had arranged financial protections for Lena's future, and had requested supervised visitation for me until the court reached a decision. My hands trembled as I flipped through the documents, the stamps and signatures staring back at me like accusations I couldn't dodge. I snapped that this was revenge, that Daniel was trying to destroy me financially and emotionally, but his lawyer calmly countered that these were preventative measures to protect the child. He said Lena's well-being came first, and Daniel had taken steps to ensure her stability. The calmness of his words made my anger feel childish. I turned to Daniel, desperate to see any trace of the man I once thought I controlled, but his face was unreadable. He didn't look at me with hate or love, only with a kind of steady pity, and that frightened me more than rage ever could. When I left the office, I called Felix, choking on my words as I told him what had happened. He tried to reassure me, saying courts almost always sided with mothers, that Daniel's preparations were just smoke and mirrors, but his voice lacked conviction, and for the first time, his confidence didn't soothe me. I hung up quickly, clutching the documents to my chest like they were both a burden and a shield. That night in my apartment, I opened my banking app only to find my access blocked. The joint accounts had been frozen, just as the lawyer had promised. My fury exploded then. I threw the phone across the room, shouting into the emptiness. Yet when I picked up the pieces, both of the phone and of myself, the truth was undeniable. Daniel wasn't bluffing anymore. Days later, during one of my scheduled visitation afternoons, Lena sat on the couch in my small apartment, swinging her legs nervously while eating the snacks I had bought. I tried to make the time feel special, talking too loudly, smiling too wide, desperate to prove I was still her mother. But she looked at me with quiet confusion. She asked softly why Daddy was so sad, why people at school whispered about her parents, why her friends' mothers asked strange questions. I tried to brush it off, telling her Daddy was just angry, that he was making things bigger than they were, but my words sounded hollow. She didn't argue, didn't cry. She just lowered her head and whispered that she wished we would stop fighting. Her small voice pierced me deeper than the legal documents, but instead of facing the truth, I told myself Daniel had poisoned her, teaching her to doubt me. At another family gathering, Marjorie confronted me openly. She told everyone that Daniel had proof, that the lawyers had already gathered statements from people who saw me at Adrian's apartment, laughing, leaning against him before I crashed on that couch. I shouted that she was lying, that gossip was not truth, but I saw the looks exchanged around the table. Even Felix didn't jump in as quickly as before, and when he did, his defense was weak. He mumbled that everyone was overreacting, but no one believed him. My father shook his head, disappointed, and my mother sighed heavily, refusing to meet my eyes. I realized then that my allies were slipping away, one by one. When the next legal meeting came, I expected Daniel's lawyer to repeat the same arguments, but instead he brought more. Witness statements from people at the bar who described how intimate I had looked with Adrian, how natural it seemed for me to lean against him. Text messages pulled from my phone records, showing I had lied to Daniel about working late that night. Each piece of evidence felt like a stone stacked onto a growing wall I couldn't climb. I tried to argue, saying it was all misinterpreted, but my lawyer's sigh beside me told me even he wasn't convinced. My voice shook as I insisted that I had done nothing wrong, but the words fell flat in the heavy silence. Daniel remained calm throughout, speaking only when necessary, his voice steady and measured. He didn't lash out, didn't call me names, didn't let emotion cloud his words. He simply presented his case, layer by layer, until the picture was clear. I had betrayed him, if not in body, then in trust, and I had humiliated him while pretending innocence. Watching him build his case so carefully, I realized with horror that while I had been spinning stories and seeking sympathy, he had been documenting, gathering, preparing. When the meeting ended, Daniel gathered his papers neatly, nodded politely, and left with his lawyer. I sat frozen in my chair, the folder of evidence heavy in front of me, my hands trembling too much to touch it. For the first time, I saw how completely he had outmaneuvered me. All my gaslighting, all my laughter, all my denials had crumbled under the weight of receipts I couldn't deny. As I walked back to my apartment in the fading evening light, I clutched the folder to my chest, the words "temporary custody" echoing in my mind like a sentence already passed. I whispered to myself again that it was just a couch, just one night, nothing more. But even I could hear the lie in my voice, thin and powerless, drowned out by the silence of the truth Daniel had built brick by brick. The courtroom felt like the final stage of a play I had been trying to rewrite since the night I crashed on Adrian's couch, but this time I wasn't holding the script. I walked in with my lawyer beside me, holding my head high, determined to look composed, even if inside my stomach churned with dread. Daniel was already there, sitting straight, his lawyer calm at his side, their folders stacked neatly like weapons. He didn't look at me, and the absence of his gaze cut more than if he had glared. When the judge entered, the room fell silent, the kind of silence that makes your heart beat louder than you want it to. Daniel's lawyer began by presenting the evidence. The photo of me asleep on Adrian's couch, the witness statements from the bar describing how close we had looked, the text messages where I had lied about working late. Each piece landed like a hammer blow, and with every page turned, I felt smaller. My lawyer tried to argue it was all circumstantial, that no physical betrayal had occurred, but the judge's questions sliced through my defenses. Why hadn't I called my husband that night? Why had I chosen an ex's apartment over returning home? Why had I dismissed my husband's concerns publicly, humiliating him in front of family? Each answer I gave sounded rehearsed, brittle, and hollow. I repeated over and over that it had been just a couch, just exhaustion, but the words rang emptier each time. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, his voice was calm, steady, and devastating. He didn't accuse me with venom. He laid out facts with patience. He explained how he had acted to protect Lena, how he had secured accounts to ensure her stability, how he had documented my lies only because he wanted the truth to stand clear. He didn't call me names, didn't lash out, didn't need to. His restraint made me look chaotic by comparison, and I knew the judge saw it too. Finally, the judge delivered the ruling. Temporary custody awarded to Daniel, financial accounts secured under his management, and a strict visitation schedule for me. The words echoed in my chest, cold and final. I wanted to scream that I was still Lena's mother, that I hadn't cheated, that it was all a misunderstanding. But when I opened my mouth, no sound came. Daniel finally looked at me then, his eyes steady, filled not with anger, but with pity, and that cut deeper than any punishment. As the gavel struck, the sound echoed like the closing of a door I could never force open again. Papers were handed to me, schedules, signatures, rules I hadn't chosen. I walked out of the courtroom with them clutched in my hands, the weight of every denial and excuse collapsing into silence. Outside on the courthouse steps, I told myself one last time it was only a couch, only a night. But even to my own ears, the words carried no power. The law had spoken, and Daniel had won. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.